Welcome to week 11. This week we're going to look at the end of the Akkadian Empire and discuss a couple of questions about the Akkadian Empire. Was it really an empire? And also how did it collapse? And then we'll start looking at what happens after this large political unit fragments. As we'll see, Mesopotamia and Mesopotamian civilization keeps on trucking, basically. So last time we were looking at how this empire was formed and some of the main kings like Sargon, who founded the empire, and Naram-Sin, who helped expand the empire and also increase the bureaucracy and the control over different areas. Well, let's look at some of the archaeological evidence for this control. As we've said before, we don't have the archives from the capital because the capital of Akkad has never been identified, but we do have some sites in northern Mesopotamia, what's now Syria, Tel Brak, and also Tel Leilan, that were regional capitals during the Akkadian period. And so we have some archaeological evidence for some of the changes at these sites and also how the empire was organized. So let's look at Tel Brak before. We've already looked at Tel Brak when we looked at the Uruk period. Now we're focused on the Akkadian period. And Tel Brak has a number of monumental buildings that date to this period that have texts that clearly allow us to draw a line from the building to the Akkadian Empire. One thing is a palace or some sort of fortress, and this is filled with storerooms that were probably used to collect commodities. It looked like the Akkadian expansion was really focused on acquiring raw materials. So the north had metals and wood, just like we talked about with the Uruk expansion, and it looks like the empire was focused on seizing territory and having these raw materials flow back to southern Mesopotamia. So this is a large fortified building. It's like over 300 feet on the side, probably built to, one, control the local population, but also make sure the trade routes were working as well. The mud bricks that made up the building are stamped with Naram-Sin's name, so that really makes it easy to date and also to draw a connection to the empire. There's also the administrative building that lies next to this palace. Okay, within that large fortified building, they had ceilings of Akkadian officials. So it looks like there was bureaucratic control over whatever was being produced and collected and probably sent back down to southern Mesopotamia. But we also see that the ceiling style was kind of a combination of local and southern Mesopotamian. So it looked like the people in Nagar, this is what its name was at this point. In the Uruk period, we don't know exactly what the people called it, but Tel Brak is the modern name, and Nagar is the ancient name. That the ceilings look like a combination of the local style and the southern Mesopotamian style. So it looks like the local administrative traditions continued during this period. A tablet that was found here at Tel Brak, ancient Nagar, from the time period of Naram-Sin, from this palace, lists men from northern cities, suggesting that there was some sort of labor levy, or maybe soldiers, right? That they're calling up people from different areas, and these people have to work, or they're being conscripted into the army. Not too far from Tel Brak, just really a few kilometers, 20 kilometers or so, is Tel Leilan, which is another ancient city that started in the 3rd millennium. It grew to the size of a pretty impressive city even before the Akkadian period, and then grew further during this Akkadian period, right? So it was already a city by 2600 BC, just like, Ebla we saw. This is part of this kind of northern Mesopotamian tradition, right? It was, about 90 hectares in 2600 BC, fairly large. It looked like it grew very quickly during the early dynastic period. And so this was another city-state. Well, during the Akkadian period, when it was conquered and became part of the empire, archaeologists found several buildings that were constructed during this empire that looks like it was, whose purpose was to help the Akkadian Empire essentially rule over this territory. So we're going to look at a couple of buildings. One, the Akkadian schoolroom, and the Akkadian house, and a palace. This gives you an idea of some of the excavations here. So in the schoolroom, this was a schoolroom that was built during the Akkadian period. And it looks like its purpose was to train local people to be officials in the Akkadian administration. Right? So essentially, they are training the bureaucrats to run this territory. They found a number of school tablets. These round tablets with repeated characters. This is how we know it's a schoolroom, because this is very typical of the kind of schools we see in ancient Mesopotamia, where they're using round tablets and they're repeating, symbols and repeating some of the cuneiform, syllabic characters or logographic characters in order to learn them. They also found what looks like a recycling bin, because they found bins like this in other cities. These were bins that had water in them, where if they, to recycle tablets that were not going to be kept, they just put them in the bin, soak them in water, and basically squish them up and reform them again to use again. Clay can be easily recycled. So it looks like that this was a school, and they were recycling their tablets after they were done, practicing their lessons. Nearby is an Akkadian house that had several ceilings in it, which shows that there was probably bureaucratic control over the activities here. There was also balls of ceiling clay that were not used, a tablet fragment, and it looks like, again, bureaucratic control, and the archaeological evidence shows there was increased agricultural production during this time. So it looks like the Akkadian Empire was influencing people to grow more crops, probably to send some of that back to southern Mesopotamia, we think, and also to support the bureaucrats in the administration here. Then there's a fortified administrative building called a palace by the archaeologists. It probably was the palace for the local governor, the person who was appointed to run this area. Within the palace, besides the fortifications, there's also a grain processing facility and an administrative office. So within the palace, they found ovens, and these were to produce lots and lots of food, grain processing facilities to get those, to get the grain ready for the ovens, and also a granary to store the grain that was collected from the countryside. And so this was sort of an essential part of the palace, the ability to feed all the people that are working for the palace. Also within the palace was the tablet room. You had a large ceramic jar, clay balls, and blank tablets. As we'll see in other sites, storage jars were used to basically keep tablets when they weren't on racks and archives like we saw in Ebla. This basalt measuring device is about the ancient equivalent of 2 sila, which is about I think 2 liters, right? So a sila is about a liter, and 2 sila or 2 liters was the standard daily ration of barley for a laborer mentioned in the Akkadian text. So it looks like this tablet room was, again, another important part of the administrative area, that they were probably dealing out rations of barley from here and keeping track and records of different things. This is a ceiling that was found from the palace, and you can see a portion of the name of the person and the term shabra, which means official. So this is a cylinder seal of one of these officials, bureaucrats in the administration. So you get the idea that this was a very well-run empire, at least what we have from the evidence at these two sites. It was also fortified, right? So they were protecting this area from outside invaders, or maybe even the people that they were ruling over. This is what's known as a glacis. This is the lower level, the foundation of a large fortification wall, where one of the best ways to fortify a wall was to create this sort of ramp at the base. And what that prevented, it prevented attackers from undermining the wall, because now instead of having to dig through, let's say, a wall that's 20 feet thick, they have to dig through something that's like 60 feet thick, for example. It also prevents ladders from being used on the wall, because you've got the lowest part of the wall is jutting out about 30 feet or so. And it also prevents siege engines. We're going to see these kinds of siege towers that you see sort of in the Middle Ages. They had rudimentary ones like this in ancient Mesopotamia. It prevents those siege towers from getting too close to the wall itself. So it's a very well designed fortification. They also had a moat around this area as well. Okay, so what can we tell from some of the settlement patterns? Well, there is kind of an increase in site size and number of sites before this period, and then during the Akkadian period, but there's not a noticeable increase as a result of the empire. At least this is what some archaeologists argue. So, for example, Mario Liverani states that if we didn't know from the text that the Akkadian Empire really existed, we would not be able to postulate it from the changes in settlement patterns or from the evolution of material culture. Right? That some archaeologists, question the idea that this was an empire like the Roman Empire, because we really see kind of a similarity in the local traditions continuing. We don't really see foreign styles from the south being imposed on this area, and we don't necessarily see a real change in the settlement like we will see during the Assyrian Empire later. This will be at the very end of the class. We will look at what's known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Assyrians mentioned in the Bible, such as Jonah going to Nineveh, which was an Assyrian capital. Some of those Assyrian palaces that we talked about in the very first week of class. This is around 600 BC. And there you do see a very sharp and dramatic shift in the settlement patterns. But you don't quite see it at this point, although, as we said, there's debate about that. And it's also complicated by the fact that the pottery from the Akkadian period is not that much different from the earlier pottery from the early dynastic. So it's kind of hard to tell differences in the sites in terms of the time periods and really see if there's a change in settlement. Okay, as we've said before, there were revolts against these Akkadian kings throughout the empire's history. Revolts near the end of Sargon's reign, revolts during Naram-Sin's reign, right? So that some of the texts say, when the four corners of the universe were hostile to him, he remained victorious in 9 battles in a single year because of the love that Ishtar had for him. But you get the sense that there's constant upheaval and constant revolts against imperial empire. The son of Naram Sin who rules after him is Shar Kali Shari, which translates to King of Kings. And he comes to the throne, again, during sort of a time of upheaval. There are raids of these people we've mentioned before called the Gudians. They're people from the Zagros who were thought of as barbarians by the southern Mesopotamians. And he also had to fight against southern Mesopotamian vassal kings who were rebelling against him, especially because of the high taxes that they had to pay to fund the military, essentially. Okay, at around the same time, near the end of Shar Kali Shari's reign, you have a drought in Egypt, and this is under a pharaoh named Pepi II, and this is when the old kingdom starts to decline and collapse, and you have what's known as the first intermediate period in Egypt. After Shar Kali Shari is killed, right, you have anarchy as a result for a while, and you have 4 different kings in the span of only 3 years. And the texts from that describe this time period say, then who was king? Who was not the king? Right? Igi, Imi, Namum, Ilulu. 4 of them ruled for only 3 years. Right? So you get, and they probably were killed too. That's sort of a good assumption. So you get a sort of an idea of upheaval. And even though you had nominal Akkadian kings after Shar Kali Shari and the end of his reign is really the end of the Akkadian Empire. Well, archaeologists like to debate, was it really an empire, right? Or was it sort of an empire of the imagination? Right? That is it remembered later on as being this great and glorious empire, but the reality is different. It's hard to answer this question because we're missing some of the data, as we've said before. So we don't know how much control there was over these other areas, how much integration of other people there was. And again, some of the later texts glorify and seem to exaggerate some of the achievements of the Akkadian kings. So it may be an empire of nostalgia, an imagined past. I think a good analogy would be the way some people think of the Confederacy during the Civil War and the antebellum South, right? And also thinking about the Civil War as this lost cause, as they call it, where it's very much a distortion of the reality. So they like to portray the South as almost sort of an Eden, right? Almost a paradise. Slaves were well treated, according to this worldview. You see it in films like Gone with the Wind. There was sort of a nobility about the South, that they were fighting for states' rights, and that there was sort of there's a romance to the Civil War. The reality is very different. Right? This was a horribly abusive system where poor whites were not doing that well either. It was really just the rich landowners and slave owners that were reaping the benefits of the system. And it was during the late 1800s, after Reconstruction, 1890s, and also the 1920s, when there was a reaction against growing civil rights, that this empire of nostalgia of the South and this lost cause view of history started to reemerge. So some people think this is what might have been going on in ancient Mesopotamia with the Akkadian Empire, that in reality it wasn't quite as much or quite as strong as it's later portrayed, but it became very important to the ideology of Mesopotamian kings. Right? When we look at empires and we think about the Roman empires, we think empires should be large, bureaucratic, economically complex, heterogeneous in terms of ethnicities and cultures and language, that there should be a larger-than-life individual like the Roman emperor with ambition and also a program to achieve it. So think of Augustus and think of these other Roman emperors who wanted to expand the empire. When we think of Rome, we think of it as a military expansive empire. It kept growing and growing and growing. Once it stopped growing is when it started to, and it had to hold on to that territory, is when it started to sort of deteriorate. Right? It had roads. The Roman Empire had roads. It had a physical infrastructure that allowed for centralization and long-distance communication. Right? So the road system in Rome was very important. So do all of these things exist for the Akkadian Empire? Yes, but not to the extent that it existed in Rome. So, from my own point of view, I would say yes, the Akkadian system was an empire. And it was the first attempt at empire building in the history of the world. It had not quite reached the complexity as Rome later on, but you got to start somewhere, I guess. So it was an interesting experiment in political integration. But again, it was also a coercive political unit, right? People didn't voluntarily join the Akkadian Empire. They were conquered and forced into this. So bureaucracy, ideology, charismatic kings, military program. We have those things with the Akkadian Empire. How tightly did they control areas in between Leilan and Brock, right? We have evidence from Brock and Leilan, but what about the smaller villages? Well, we don't have the evidence yet because we don't have enough excavations from those areas to really tell. If we had, let's say, a village that was a few kilometers outside of Brock, where we have seal impressions from administrators from Brock, we could say, oh yes, it looks like there was control in the countryside as well. That would lend more credence to this idea. As of yet, we don't really have that. Right? What about the material culture? Well, it's not homogeneous across the empire, right? And also, we don't see Akkadian styles bleeding over into the hinterlands, into the areas outside of the empire. Right? So, some people would see Tel Leilan and Tel Brock as these kind of outposts, but in between and around, there was no control by the empire itself. Also, what about those 5,400 people that Sargon of Akkad describes? Are they laborers? Are they administrators? Are they soldiers? We don't really know. The records talk about funding and equipment and supplies for the army, so we get an idea that there was some sort of standing army. But as one archaeologist, Augusta McMahon, puts it, army and warfare are neither sufficient nor unique to empire, right? That is, we had an army and you had warfare in the early dynastic period. So having a large army doesn't necessarily mean that it was an empire. The Akkadian kings depended on warriors. And the army was very important, but you also get the impression from the text that insurrection was happening all the time. And a lot of these kings were assassinated or met a violent death in other means. Rimush, Manishtushu, Shar-Kali-Shari, those four kings during the 3-year period, right, were all killed. And so you don't get a sense that there is a lot of stability during the Akkadian Empire. Are they controlling places and not actual people? The Akkadian texts never talk about the people they conquered as subjects. They just talk about them as sort of a body count. The texts focus on the regions, right? Like the Cedar Forest or the Silver Mountains, the Four Quarters, the sources of the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, but never actually talk about the people as being the subjects of the empire. So it almost looks like they were going up there, seizing control, killing people, controlling resources, but not necessarily ruling over the people themselves. And we also get the idea that the trade was not monopolistic, that other people had access to the trade as well. Okay, well, let's look at the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. The reasons for its collapse, how it collapsed. This has been a pretty hotly debated topic, and one that's pretty interesting. So let's look at some of the reasons archaeologists posit for the collapse of the empire, some of the evidence for this collapse, and some of the debate that surrounds the collapse.